In the vast, interconnected world we inhabit, there are events so sudden, so seismic, that they ripple across continents in mere hours. Today we find ourselves at the crossroads of such an event, a striking escalation, a clash between Iran and Israel, has ignited more than just military alarm. It has triggered a chain reaction that now grips the global economy in a state of unrest. At the heart of the Earth's energy system lies a delicate artery, the Middle East. Within this region, the Strait of Hormuz, no wider than a few dozen miles, channels a fifth of the world's oil. And now, that fragile artery is pulsing under the pressure of conflict. Tankers that once moved silently under the moonlit waters now face hesitation, delay, and fear. The lifeblood of modern civilization, oil, is under siege. As night fell over the Persian Gulf, traders in London, New York, and Shanghai watched numbers leap off their screens. Brent crude surged past thresholds once thought improbable, and West Texas Intermediate wasn't far behind. Panic spread, not in a shout but a whisper. In the flicker of screen lights, in the recalculations of fuel surcharges, in the revised logistics of everyday goods. The shock, however, extends beyond the marketplace. For the average family, it manifests not as a news headline, but as an extra few dollars at the pump, a postponed trip, or a more expensive grocery bill. It arrives subtly, yet persistently, threading its way into daily decisions. A storm not of wind or water, but of economics, sweeping silently through societies. In boardrooms and war rooms alike, the urgency is unmistakable. Governments scramble, strategic reserves are eyed, alliances tested, and emergency meetings convened. Yet amid all the calculation lies a single sobering truth. The world's dependence on fossil energy remains a tether, binding the fate of billions to distant, volatile lands. And so, the Earth watches. Not in silence, but in tension. Oil prices have soared, markets have convulsed, and millions are on edge. The escalation of the Iran-Israel conflict has become one of the most significant geopolitical flashpoints in recent years, shaking the foundations of regional stability and sending shockwaves through the global system. Historically, tensions between Iran and Israel have simmered beneath the surface, driven by deep-rooted ideological, religious, and political rivalries. However, the recent direct strikes between the two nations represent a dangerous turning point, moving beyond proxy engagements and cyber confrontations into open military exchanges. These attacks have intensified fears that the conflict could spill over into a broader regional war involving multiple actors, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, various armed groups in Syria and Iraq, and potentially even global superpowers indirectly aligned with either side. What makes this escalation especially alarming is the timing and location. Occurring in a region responsible for nearly a third of the world's oil production and a significant portion of its transportation routes, any disruption in this area threatens to choke vital energy supplies to Asia, Europe, and beyond. The psychological impact on global markets has been immediate. With missiles launched and military installations struck, the perception of risk has skyrocketed. Investors, analysts, and governments alike understand that even the possibility of further escalation is enough to trigger economic consequences. The conflict has also raised concerns over the vulnerability of critical infrastructure in the Middle East, including oil fields, refineries, pipelines, and ports. A single targeted strike on one of these facilities could send oil prices soaring even higher and trigger retaliatory actions that further destabilize the region. Diplomatic efforts to de-escalate have so far proved ineffective, as both nations frame their actions as defensive responses to aggression. The international community remains divided, with calls for restraint largely overshadowed by the urgency of protecting strategic interests. Meanwhile, media coverage has magnified the crisis, fueling public anxiety and political pressure in countries already grappling with economic challenges. The fear of a drawn-out military confrontation has pushed nations and markets into a state of heightened alert. Military analysts warn that if these hostilities continue unchecked, they could reshape the power dynamics of the Middle East for years to come. The risk extends beyond immediate combat zones, influencing everything from global energy policy to defense strategies and humanitarian concerns. The global oil supply chain is one of the most intricate and vulnerable systems in the modern economy, and its stability is heavily reliant on specific geographic choke points. Among these, the Strait of Hormuz stands as the most critical. This narrow waterway, situated between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, is the route through which approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes daily. The recent escalation of conflict between Iran and Israel has thrown this strategic passage into the spotlight, as fears mount over its potential closure or disruption. Iran, possessing significant influence over the strait, has previously hinted at using it as leverage in times of heightened tensions. Any serious threat to shipping through this route instantly sends ripples across global markets, raising alarm about delayed deliveries, increased transportation risks, and skyrocketing insurance premiums for tankers. The conflict has not yet resulted in a full blockade, but the mere prospect of it has been enough to shake market confidence. Major oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iraq and Kuwait heavily rely on the Strait of Hormuz for their exports. Disruption here would not only affect their revenues, but also create a global shortage that drives up prices across all sectors. Refineries in Asia, Europe and North America, many of which depend on Middle Eastern oil, would be forced to scramble for alternatives, creating a cascade of logistical complications. Oil tankers have already begun rerouting or slowing down, awaiting clearer signals about safety and navigational permissions. Naval forces, including those from the US and allied countries, have increased their presence in the area to ensure freedom of navigation. But their deployment also heightens the chances of accidental military engagements. The strategic significance of the strait has made it a focal point in international energy security discussions. Governments are now urgently reviewing their emergency oil stockpiles and alternate routes, including pipelines that bypass the strait, although their capacity is limited and insufficient to fully replace the flow disrupted from sea routes. The fragility of the oil supply chain, laid bare by these geopolitical tensions, serves as a stark reminder of how dependent modern economies remain on the uninterrupted movement of fossil fuels. In times of peace, this dependency is often overlooked, but conflict forces it to the surface with immediate and global consequences. The sudden spike in crude oil prices following the Iran-Israeli strikes is a stark demonstration of how geopolitical volatility directly affects global energy markets. In the hours after news of the attacks broke, oil benchmarks such as Brent crude and West Texas Intermediate (WTI) surged dramatically, with gains exceeding 20% in some cases. Markets responded not only to the immediate threat posed by military escalation, but also to the anticipation of prolonged instability in one of the world's most oil-sensitive regions. Traders, investors, and energy analysts understood that the attacks signaled a breakdown in predictability and increased the likelihood of further disruptions to supply. Fear, rather than physical shortages, became the driving force behind the price surge. In global commodities markets, perception and future risk are often as influential as current conditions. The spike in prices was also amplified by speculative trading and algorithmic responses, with automated systems executing high-volume trades based on keywords and volatility patterns. The oil market is particularly sensitive to Middle Eastern tensions because of the concentration of production capacity and limited flexibility in quickly replacing disrupted supply. Most spare capacity is held by a few producers, primarily in OPEC, and deploying this capacity takes time and carries political implications. As prices rose, oil-importing nations faced immediate economic strain. Developing economies, which are already struggling with post-pandemic inflation and debt, were particularly vulnerable. Higher oil prices directly translate to increased transportation and production costs, raising prices on goods, reducing household purchasing power, and potentially leading to social unrest. In advanced economies, central banks that were considering interest rate cuts have had to reconsider their strategies to avoid triggering further inflation. Airlines, shipping companies, and logistics firms began recalculating their cost projections, passing the burden down to consumers through fuel surcharges and price hikes. The price volatility also posed significant challenges to industries that rely heavily on petroleum-based inputs from manufacturing to agriculture. This price surge reflected not just a momentary market panic, but a deep-seated fragility in global energy systems. With every dollar increase in oil, the economic consequences ripple across national borders, affecting livelihoods, corporate strategies, and government policies. The market's reaction to the Iran-Israel conflict was a reminder that in a globally connected system, regional tensions have the power to trigger financial shocks on an international scale. The economic shockwaves triggered by the Iran-Israel conflict have been felt across global financial markets, revealing the intricate and immediate connection between geopolitics and economic stability. Stock markets around the world reacted sharply to the surge in oil prices and the uncertainty surrounding the escalating hostilities. Key indices in the United States, Europe, and Asia experienced sudden drops, with energy-sensitive sectors such as transportation, manufacturing, and consumer goods bearing the brunt of investor anxiety. The financial world functions on forecasts and risk management, and when geopolitical events upend expectations, panic often follows. This latest conflict introduced layers of uncertainty that make market valuation difficult, especially when future oil availability and pricing are in flux. Companies dependent on fuel for logistics, aviation, and production saw their stock values decline, while investors flocked towards safe haven assets like gold, government bonds, and the US dollar. Commodities trading became increasingly volatile as speculators and institutional investors rushed to hedge against potential losses. Meanwhile, energy companies experienced rapid valuation shifts, with oil producers seeing short-term gains while refiners and distributors faced margin pressure due to cost unpredictability. The conflict also created challenges for national economies dependent on oil import. Rising energy prices forced many countries to adjust their budgetary forecasts, reallocate subsidies, and manage currency depreciation resulting from higher import bills. For economies already dealing with inflationary pressures, the oil shock served as an accelerant, making it more difficult for central banks to strike a balance between growth and price control. In addition, emerging markets suffered from capital flight, as risk-averse investors withdrew funds in search of more stable returns. This outflow weakened local currencies and complicated debt repayment for countries reliant on foreign-denominated loans. Market analysts began issuing warnings about potential recessions if the conflict dragged on or escalated further. Supply chain disruptions loomed large as well, with shipping insurers raising rates and cargo carriers avoiding risky routes. All these factors combined to create a feedback loop, where economic reactions to the conflict intensified its global impact. Financial markets, built on confidence and predictability, were reminded that regional conflicts in resource-rich zones can quickly become global economic crises. Regardless of their distance from the battlefield, remain deeply vulnerable to the tremors of geopolitical instability. The ripple effects of rising oil prices are being felt most acutely in the daily lives of ordinary people around the world. As the Iran-Israel conflict intensifies and crude oil prices surge, the immediate impact is seen at fuel stations, grocery stores, and utility bills. Consumers are confronting higher costs for gasoline and diesel, which not only affects individual transportation expenses, but also increases the price of transporting goods across supply chains. This leads to an overall rise in the cost of essential items, including food, clothing, and household products. Air travel has also become more expensive, as airlines introduce fuel surcharges to offset the soaring costs of aviation fuel. Public transportation systems in many countries, particularly those without heavy government subsidies, are adjusting fare structures to remain financially sustainable. For working-class families, especially in developing nations, this additional financial strain can mean cutting back on other critical needs such as healthcare, education, or housing. Farmers and manufacturers, who depend on petroleum-based inputs such as fertilizers, machinery fuel, and plastics, are facing increased production costs. These costs are often passed on to consumers, contributing to inflationary pressure. Urban populations are seeing their electricity and heating bills rise, particularly in regions that rely on oil-filled power generation or imported energy. Small businesses, many still recovering from the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, are now being forced to re-evaluate their operating budgets. Delivery services, food vendors, and local transport operators are raising prices, which has a compounding effect on local economies. Inflation triggered by oil price shocks erodes purchasing power and increases the cost of living, especially in economies where wages have not kept pace. Governments are under pressure to offer relief measures, such as fuel subsidies or direct cash transfers, but such policies strain public budgets and can only be maintained temporarily. Consumer sentiment has begun to shift toward caution, with many households reducing discretionary spending. This pullback in consumption can slow economic recovery and deepen financial uncertainty. The situation reveals how fragile everyday life becomes when energy prices spike, especially in a world still heavily reliant on fossil fuels. The geopolitical conflict, though occurring far from most people's homes, translates into direct, tangible hardships for millions. It underscores the vulnerability of global citizens to events they cannot control, but must inevitably bear the consequences of. The geopolitical uncertainty stemming from the Iran-Israeli conflict has triggered a swift and strategic response from major global powers, with particular focus on securing energy resources and ensuring market stability. Nations heavily dependent on oil in parts of Asia and the United States have begun reviewing and in some cases releasing oil from their strategic petroleum reserves. These reserves are designed specifically for crises like this, when a sudden shock threatens to destabilize energy supplies and provoke severe economic consequences. While emergency releases can temporarily ease pressure on markets and calm investor panic, they are finite and cannot compensate for a prolonged disruption in Middle Eastern oil flows. This has led to urgent diplomatic initiatives aimed at de-escalating tensions, ensuring maritime security, and restoring confidence in uninterrupted energy movement. Countries such as China, India, and members of the Gulf Cooperation Council have ramped up back-channel communications with both Iran and Israel, while global institutions like the United Nations and OPEC remain involved in efforts to maintain regional equilibrium. In addition to diplomatic overtures, several countries are accelerating plans to diversify their energy sources. Investments in renewable energy projects, alternative oil supplies, and domestic production are being fast-tracked to reduce vulnerability to future geopolitical crises. However, these measures take time to implement, leaving the current situation largely exposed to further instability. Smaller, energy import-dependent nations face even greater challenges, as they lack both the reserves and the geopolitical clout to influence outcomes or secure preferential access to oil. Their exposure to fuel price inflation and energy shortages makes them particularly susceptible to economic downturns, social unrest, and political instability. Multinational corporations in the energy and shipping sectors are also adjusting rapidly. Insurers have raised premiums for vessels navigating near conflict zones, while oil companies are re-evaluating exploration and export schedules. The uncertainty has made long-term energy planning increasingly complex, with policymakers juggling immediate needs against longer-term sustainability goals. This geopolitical strain has underscored the global economy's continued reliance on fossil fuels and how any disruption, particularly in a volatile region like the Middle East, can rapidly evolve into a crisis of international proportions. Strategic oil reserves, diplomatic leverage, and rapid policy shifts are being deployed not as precautionary tools, but as immediate responses to a fast-moving situation that threatens to alter the balance of energy security across continents. In conclusion, the recent Iran-Israel conflict has shaken the world far beyond the battlefield. From the strategic choke point of the Strait of Hormuz to the wallets of everyday citizens, the consequences of this escalation have spread rapidly across the globe. Crude oil prices have surged, supply chains have been threatened, and global markets have entered a state of uncertainty. Strategic reserves are being tapped, economies are straining under rising inflation, and millions are facing the burden of higher living costs. This crisis has exposed the delicate web of dependency the modern world has on energy stability and geopolitical balance. It is a stark reminder that in our interconnected world, a spark in one region can ignite tremors that are felt by all. Thank you for taking the time to engage with this critical topic. Stay informed, stay resilient, and may peace and clarity guide the days ahead. Good luck, and thank you.